In a quiet little town in Ohio, there lived a man named Harold Quinn. Harold was not your ordinary neighbor. He had always been the kind of person who liked to tinker with things, taking apart old radios, building strange gadgets, and dreaming up inventions that most people thought were impossible. Some folks found him amusing, others thought he was odd, but everyone agreed on one thing. Harold Quinn was full of big ideas. For years, Harold had been working on something he called the Miniaturization Project. It sounded like science fiction, but Harold claimed it was real. He said he had discovered a way to shrink living beings down to microscopic sizes while keeping them fully functional. Not only that, but he insisted these tiny humans could still think, move, and act, just like their normal-sized counterparts. Naturally, no one believed him. Most people thought it was all nonsense, a wild story cooked up by a man who spent too much time alone in his garage. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Harold decided it was time to show the world what he had been working on. He rented out the local community center and invited everyone in town to come see his invention. Word spread quickly, and soon the room was packed with curious neighbors, skeptical friends, and even a few reporters from the local newspaper. Among the crowd were two very different people, Brian Dawson, a loud and opinionated mechanic, and Sarah Miller, a thoughtful journalist looking for her next big story. As people filed into the room, they whispered among themselves. "Do you think it's real?" one woman asked. "Of course not," her husband replied. "It's probably just some toy soldiers or a cheap trick." Others nodded in agreement. No one took Harold seriously except maybe Lena Carter, a shy, high school science teacher who stood near the back of the room. She had always admired Harold's creativity, even if she didn't understand half of what he talked about. When Harold walked up to the front of the room carrying a glass case, the murmurs grew louder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold began, his voice trembling slightly with excitement, "thank you for coming today. I know many of you have doubts about my work, but I assure you, what you're about to see is real. This is the result of years of research and experimentation, the world's first miniaturized human army." He set the glass case down on a table and stepped aside so everyone could get a better look. Inside the case were several figures, each no taller than a thumb. They wore tiny uniforms, carried miniature weapons, and moved with precision, marching in perfect formation. The crowd gasped, but not because they were impressed. Instead, laughter erupted throughout the room. "Is this a joke?" Brian shouted, his booming voice cutting through the noise. "Are we supposed to believe those are real people? Come on, Harold, give us a break." Others joined in, laughing and shaking their heads. Even Sarah, who had come hoping to write an inspiring article, couldn't help but chuckle. It did look ridiculous, a bunch of doll-sized soldiers parading around like toys. Harold tried to explain further. "These are real humans," he said, earnestly. "Volunteers who have undergone a safe and reversible process to reduce their size. They've been trained to perform tasks that would be impossible for regular-sized individuals. Imagine the possibilities: rescue missions in tight spaces, surgical procedures at a cellular level, covert operations where stealth is crucial." But his words fell on deaf ears. The more Harold spoke, the more the crowd laughed. Brian, feeling particularly bold, walked up to the table and tapped on the glass case. "Yeah, sure, Harold," he said sarcastically. "And I bet they can fly too, right? Or maybe shoot lasers out of their eyes?" The comment drew even more laughter, and Harold's face turned red with frustration. He opened his mouth to respond. But before he could say anything, a soft voice spoke up from the back of the room. "Can you tell me more about how it works?" Everyone turned to see Lena standing there, her arms crossed, and her expression serious. Harold blinked in surprise. Out of everyone in the room, she was the only one who seemed genuinely interested. For a moment he hesitated, unsure whether to trust her. But then he nodded. "Yes, of course," he said. "If you'd like, I can explain everything after the demonstration." Lena smiled faintly and stepped forward, ignoring the snickers from the crowd. As the event wrapped up and people began to leave, she stayed behind, watching as Harold carefully packed away the glass case. Brian, still grinning, lingered near the door. "Good luck convincing anyone, Harold. he called over his shoulder. You'll need it. Once the room was nearly empty, Lena approached Harold. I'm sorry about how they treated you, she said softly. I don't think what you're doing is silly. In fact, I think it's amazing. Can you really shrink people without harming them? Harold looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of mockery. When he found none, he sighed and nodded. Yes, it's true, he admitted. It's complicated, but it works. I've spent years perfecting the process, and every single volunteer has returned to their original size without any side effects. Lena's eyes widened. That's incredible, she said. How does it work? What kind of technology are you using? Harold hesitated again, weighing whether or not to share his secrets with someone he barely knew. But there was something about Lena's curiosity that reminded him of himself when he was younger, eager, open-minded, and unafraid to ask questions. Finally, he relented. Come with me, he said, gesturing toward the exit. I'll show you my lab. Together they left the community center and made their way to Harold's house, which doubled as his workshop. The inside was cluttered with tools, wires, and blueprints scattered across every surface. In the corner of the room sat a large machine that hummed softly, its metallic frame gleaming under the dim light. Harold explained that this was the device he used to shrink his volunteers, though he refused to go into detail about how it worked. What, about the soldiers? Lena asked. Who are they? How did you convince them to do this? Harold smiled faintly. They're brave men and women who believe in the potential of this technology, he said. Some are former military personnel, others are scientists or engineers. They understand the risks, but they also understand the rewards. Together, we're proving that size doesn't matter when it comes to making a difference. Lena listened intently, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at what Harold had accomplished, even if the rest of the town refused to take him seriously. As she prepared to leave, she turned to him and said, Don't let them get to you, Harold. One day they'll see how wrong they were. Harold nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. For now, he would continue working in the shadows, waiting for the moment when the world would finally recognize the value of his tiny army. Little did he know, that moment was closer than he thought, and it would come in the form of a crisis that no one saw coming. Over the next few weeks, Lena Carter became a regular visitor at Harold Quinn's workshop. She was fascinated by his invention and eager to learn as much as she could about the tiny army. Harold, grateful for her support, began sharing more details about the project. He explained how the miniaturization process worked, though he still kept some parts of it secret, and introduced her to two key members of the team, Ethan Cole and Mia Roberts. Ethan was a former Marine who had joined the project after leaving the military. Tall and muscular before being shrunk, he now stood only a few inches tall, but carried himself with the same confidence and discipline. His role in the tiny army was that of a strategist, planning missions and leading the team through dangerous situations. Despite his small size, Ethan commanded respect from everyone around him. Mia, on the other hand, was an engineer whose skills were crucial to the success of the project. Before joining the team, she had worked on designing advanced robotics, but nothing compared to the challenge of creating tools and equipment for humans the size of action figures. From miniature grappling hooks to scaled-down communication devices, Mia's inventions allowed the tiny soldiers to perform tasks that seemed impossible for their diminutive frames. Lena spent hours talking to both Ethan and Mia, learning about their experiences and what motivated them to volunteer for such an unusual mission. At first I thought it was crazy, Ethan admitted during one of their conversations. But then I realized how much good we could do. We're not just small, we're powerful. There are places normal-sized people can't go, problems they can't solve. That's where we come in. Mia nodded in agreement. It's not just about shrinking, she added. It's about expanding possibilities. Imagine exploring inside the human body to deliver medicine directly to tumors, or crawling through collapsed buildings to find survivors trapped under rubble. Size isn't a limitation, it's an advantage. As Lena listened, she couldn't help but feel inspired. These weren't just ordinary people, they were pioneers pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And yet, despite their extraordinary abilities, they faced constant ridicule from those who refused to believe in Harold's invention. Brian Dawson, the mechanic who had mocked Harold at the community center, continued to spread doubt wherever he went. He wrote a scathing blog post titled, "The Tiny Army Hoax," calling Harold a fraud and accusing him of wasting time and resources on a pointless project. The article gained traction online, drawing criticism from people across the country. Some even called for Harold to stop his experiments altogether, claiming they were unethical and dangerous. Harold tried to ignore the backlash, but it wasn't easy. Every negative comment stung, especially when it came from people he knew personally. Even Sarah Miller, the journalist who had attended the demonstration, seemed hesitant to write anything positive about the project. Instead, she focused on the controversy, publishing articles that questioned whether Harold's claims were legitimate. Despite the growing skepticism, Harold remained determined to prove his critics wrong. He poured all his energy into improving the technology and training the tiny army for real-world missions. Lena noticed how hard he worked and admired his perseverance. "You're going to change the world, Harold," she told him one evening, as they reviewed blueprints together. Just give it time. But Harold wasn't sure if he had that kind of time. The pressure was mounting, and he knew he needed a way to silence his detractors once and for all. Then one day, an opportunity presented itself, an opportunity that would test the limits of the tiny army and force the world to take notice. It started with a phone call. A local chemical plant had suffered a catastrophic accident, causing toxic gas to leak from ruptured tanks. Emergency responders were struggling to contain the situation because debris blocked access to the source of the leak. Without intervention, thousands of lives were at risk. Desperate for a solution, authorities reached out to Harold, hoping his tiny army might be able to navigate the wreckage and shut off the valves. When Harold received the call, his heart raced. This was exactly the kind of scenario he had envisioned when he first started the project. But it was also dangerous. If something went wrong, it wouldn't just be the tiny army in jeopardy, it would be his entire reputation. Still, he knew he couldn't turn down the chance to make a difference. He gathered the team immediately. Ethan, Mia, and 6 other volunteers suited up in protective gear designed to shield them from the toxic environment. Each piece of equipment had been meticulously crafted by Mia, ensuring it was lightweight yet durable enough to withstand the harsh conditions. As they prepared to board a specially designed drone that would transport them into the facility, Harold addressed the group. "This is it," he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "Everything we've worked for has led to this moment. You're not just proving yourselves, you're proving the value of this technology. Stay focused, stay safe, and remember why you're here." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "We've got this, Harold," he said. "Trust us." With that, the team climbed aboard the drone, which hovered briefly before flying toward the disaster site. Back at the command center, Harold and Lena monitored their progress via live feeds. Screens displayed footage from tiny cameras mounted on the soldiers' helmets, showing their journey through jagged metal shards and narrow pipes. It was nerve-wracking to watch, knowing how fragile their situation was. Meanwhile, Brian Dawson arrived at the scene, drawn by the commotion. He had heard about the operation and wanted to see it for himself. At first, he smirked, convinced it was all a publicity stunt. But as news cameras captured images of the tiny soldiers successfully navigating the wreckage and reaching the valves, his confidence began to waver. "They're actually doing it," someone in the crowd whispered. "Those little guys are saving lives." Brian frowned, unsure of what to think. For the first time, he found himself questioning his own skepticism. Could Harold's invention really be as groundbreaking as he claimed? Back at the command center, Lena held her breath as the tiny army worked tirelessly to shut off the valves. Every second felt like an eternity, but finally, the mission was complete. The leak was contained, and the threat was neutralized. Cheers erupted among the emergency responders, and soon the news spread far and wide. The tiny army had done the impossible, proving that greatness isn't determined by size but by courage and determination. And as the world watched in awe, Harold Quinn finally earned the recognition he deserved, not as a mad scientist but as a visionary who dared to dream big, even when others laughed. The moment the tiny army completed their mission at the chemical plant, everything changed. News of their success spread like wildfire, not just locally but across the country. Footage of the miniature soldiers navigating the wreckage and shutting off the toxic gas valves went viral on social media. People who had once mocked Harold Quinn's invention were now watching in awe as these tiny heroes saved thousands of lives. For the first time, the world saw the true potential of what Harold had created. At the command center, Harold sat in stunned silence as the reality of what had just happened sank in. He glanced at Lena, who was smiling so brightly it lit up the entire room. "We did it," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Harold nodded, still processing the magnitude of the moment. All those years of hard work, ridicule, and doubt had led to this, proof that his tiny army wasn't just a dream, but a real force for good. Ethan, Mia, and the rest of the team returned safely from the mission, their protective suits smeared with dirt and grime, but their spirits high. They gathered around Harold, eager to share their experiences. "It was tough," Ethan admitted, "but we knew what was at stake. We weren't going to let anyone down." Mia chimed in, describing how she had modified one of her tools mid-mission to bypass a stubborn valve. "If we hadn't been prepared, things could have gone south fast," she said, "but we stuck together, and we got the job done." Harold listened intently, pride swelling in his chest. These individuals weren't just volunteers, they were pioneers, proving that size didn't limit capability. As he looked at them, he realized something else. They weren't alone anymore. The world was finally starting to see the value of their work. Outside, Brian Dawson stood among the crowd of reporters and onlookers, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He had come to the scene expecting to write another skeptical article, maybe even mock Harold further. But as he watched the footage of the tiny army working together to save lives, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. It was real. These miniature soldiers had accomplished something no one else could. For days after the incident, Brian wrestled with his thoughts. He replayed the video over and over, studying every detail. The tiny army moved with precision, their teamwork flawless. How could he have dismissed this as a joke? Slowly, guilt began to creep in. He thought about all the times he had laughed at Harold, called him names, and encouraged others to do the same. Now, faced with undeniable evidence, he felt ashamed. One morning, Brian decided to visit Harold's workshop. When he arrived, he found Harold tinkering with one of his machines, surrounded by blueprints and tools. Lena was there too, helping organize some papers. Both looked up when they heard the door creak open. "Brian," Harold said, his tone neutral, "what brings you here?" Brian hesitated, then stepped inside. I wanted to say something," he began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I owe you an apology. I've been wrong about your project from the start. What you've done, it's incredible. Those tiny soldiers proved me wrong, and I'm sorry for doubting you." Harold blinked, clearly surprised. He hadn't expected this kind of admission, especially not from Brian. After a long pause, he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. "Apology accepted." Lena smiled faintly, sensing the significance of the moment. "This is a big step," she said to Brian. "Not everyone has the courage to admit when they're wrong." Brian shrugged, looking uncomfortable but sincere. "Yeah, well, I guess I needed to see it with my own eyes to believe it. You've earned my respect, Harold. And if you ever need help spreading the word about your project, count me in." With that, Brian left, leaving Harold and Lena alone, again. "That was unexpected," Lena remarked, raising an eyebrow. Harold chuckled. "People can surprise you sometimes." As word of the tiny army's success continued to spread, interest in Harold's project skyrocketed. Scientists, engineers, and government officials from around the world reached out, eager to learn more about the technology. Offers poured in, from funding opportunities to collaboration proposals. For the first time, Harold didn't have to fight for recognition. People were coming to him. Despite the newfound attention, Harold remained grounded. He reminded everyone that the true heroes were the brave men and women who made up the tiny army. "They're the ones taking the risks," he told reporters during an interview. "Without their courage and dedication, none of this would be possible." Ethan and Mia became symbols of hope and innovation, their stories inspiring countless others. Interviews with them appeared in newspapers and on television, highlighting their journey from skeptics to believers. Ethan spoke passionately about the importance of teamwork and adaptability, while Mia emphasized the role of creativity in solving complex problems. Together, they painted a picture of what it meant to be part of something bigger than themselves. Lena, inspired by the tiny army's bravery, decided to pursue her own dreams more seriously. She had always loved science, but witnessing Harold's perseverance ignited a spark within her. She enrolled in advanced robotics courses and began working on projects that combined her passion for education with cutting-edge technology. Her goal was simple: to inspire the next generation of innovators just as Harold had inspired her. Meanwhile, Harold continued refining his invention. With increased resources and support, he expanded the scope of the tiny army's missions. From medical procedures requiring extreme precision to environmental cleanups in hard-to-reach areas, the possibilities seemed endless. Each new challenge brought fresh opportunities for growth and learning. Back in town, attitudes toward Harold shifted dramatically. Neighbors who had once laughed at his ideas now greeted him with respect and admiration. Children looked up to him as a hero, asking questions about science and dreaming of joining the tiny army someday. Even Sarah Miller, the journalist who had initially hesitated to cover the project positively, wrote a glowing article praising Harold's contributions to society. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from Brian Dawson. True to his word, he used his platform to advocate for Harold's work, writing articles and giving interviews that highlighted the importance of supporting unconventional ideas. His transformation from skeptic to supporter served as a powerful reminder that it's never too late to change your mind, and that humility can lead to growth. As months passed, the tiny army became a household name, synonymous with innovation and bravery. Their story inspired books, documentaries, and even a movie. Yet through it all, Harold stayed focused on the future. He knew there was still so much to discover, so many challenges to overcome. The journey was far from over. One evening, as Harold sat in his workshop reflecting on everything that had happened, Lena joined him. "You've changed the world, Harold," she said softly. "What's next?" Harold smiled, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "The sky's the limit," he replied. "Or maybe in our case, the microscope's the limit." They both laughed, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together, with courage, determination, and a little bit of imagination. Months after the chemical plant disaster, life in the small Ohio town had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. Harold Quinn's tiny army was no longer a local curiosity or a subject of ridicule. It was a global phenomenon. The technology that once seemed like science fiction had proven its worth, and now the world couldn't get enough of it. Governments, research institutions, and private companies were lining up to collaborate with Harold, eager to explore new applications for his invention. Harold, however, remained humble despite the attention. He continued working tirelessly in his workshop, refining the miniaturization process and training new volunteers for the tiny army. Ethan Cole and Mia Roberts became household names, their bravery inspiring people around the globe. Together, they led missions that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, rescuing survivors from collapsed mines, repairing delicate machinery inside nuclear reactors, and even aiding surgeons during complex medical procedures. Lena Carter, too, had found her place in this new world. Her passion for science and innovation had grown stronger than ever, fueled by the lessons she learned from Harold and the tiny army. She began teaching robotics and engineering classes at the high school, encouraging her students to think creatively and embrace challenges. Many of them were fascinated by the idea of shrinking humans and dreamed of contributing to similar breakthroughs someday. Lena often invited Harold to speak to her classes, and watching her students' eyes light up with wonder reminded her why she had fallen in love with science in the first place. Brian Dawson, once the loudest critic of Harold's project, had undergone a remarkable transformation. His apology to Harold wasn't just lip service. He genuinely believed in the potential of the tiny army and wanted to help share its story with the world. Brian started writing articles and giving talks about the importance of supporting unconventional ideas using Harold's journey as an example. "We laughed at him," Brian would say during interviews, "but he proved us wrong, not through words, but through action. That's the power of believing in something bigger than yourself." Even Sarah Miller, the skeptical journalist who had initially hesitated to write positively about the project, had become one of its biggest advocates. Her articles about the tiny army's achievements earned her awards and recognition, and she often credited Harold for reigniting her passion for storytelling. "Sometimes," she wrote in one piece, "the most extraordinary stories come from the unlikeliest places, and Harold Quinn's garage is proof of that." As the tiny army's fame grew, so did the challenges they faced. Each mission tested their limits in new ways, forcing them to adapt and innovate constantly. One particularly difficult assignment involved navigating the intricate network of pipes inside a massive oil tanker that had sprung a leak deep underwater. The regular-sized divers couldn't reach the source of the problem due to the tight spaces and extreme pressure, so the tiny army stepped in. Equipped with specially designed diving suits and oxygen tanks scaled down to fit their size, Ethan, Mia, and their team ventured into the dark, murky depths. Guided by sonar imaging and communication devices built by Mia, they worked together to locate the leak and seal it before the damage worsened. It was a grueling task, requiring hours of focus and precision, but they succeeded where others had failed. When they returned to the surface, exhausted but triumphant, they were greeted with cheers from the crew waiting above. The success of the oil tanker mission further cemented the tiny army's reputation as indispensable heroes. Yet, despite their growing fame, Harold never lost sight of why he had started the project in the first place: to make a difference. He often reminded his team that their work wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about helping people and solving problems that no one else could tackle. One evening, after a long day of training new recruits, Harold sat with Lena in his workshop. The room was cluttered as always, but there was a sense of calm in the air. "Do you ever stop and think about how far we've come?" Lena asked, sipping a cup of coffee. Harold chuckled. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember how much farther we still have to go. There's so much more we can do with this technology, if we're willing to keep pushing boundaries." Lena nodded thoughtfully. "It's funny," she said. "When I first heard about your project, I thought it sounded impossible. But now I realize that nothing is truly impossible if you believe in it enough, and if you have the right people by your side." Harold smiled, glancing at the framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of the tiny army taken after their first successful mission, each member smiling proudly despite their small size. "You're right," he said. "None of this would have been possible without them. They're the real heroes." In the months that followed, the tiny army tackled increasingly ambitious missions, from exploring ancient ruins too fragile for human hands to infiltrating secure facilities for intelligence agencies. Their versatility knew no bounds. Their success inspired other scientists and inventors to pursue bold ideas, sparking a wave of innovation across multiple fields. For Harold, the highlight of this new chapter came when he received an invitation to speak at a prestigious international conference on advanced technology. Standing on stage in front of thousands of attendees, he shared his journey, from the early days of skepticism and ridicule to the groundbreaking achievements of the tiny army. "Greatness isn't determined by size," he told the audience. "It's determined by heart. These brave men and women have shown us that even the smallest among us can make the biggest impact." His speech earned a standing ovation, and afterward, Countless people approached him to express their admiration and gratitude. Among them was a young girl named Emily, who shyly handed him a drawing she had made of the tiny army. "Thank you for showing me that anything is possible," she said before running back to her parents. That moment stayed with Harold long after the conference ended. It reminded him of why he had dedicated his life to this project, not for fame or fortune, but to inspire others to dream big and believe in themselves. Back home, the tiny army continued to grow, welcoming new members and taking on new challenges. Ethan and Mia remained at the forefront, leading with courage and determination. They often reflected on how far they had come since joining Harold's project, grateful for the opportunity to be part of something so meaningful. As for Lena, she found joy in watching her students embrace science and creativity. Many of them went on to pursue careers in STEM fields, citing Harold's tiny army as their inspiration. Knowing she had played a role in shaping their futures filled her with pride. Years later, when historians looked back on this period, they would call it the dawn of a new era, an era defined not by limitations but by possibilities. And at the heart of it all was a man named Harold Quinn, whose belief in the power of imagination had changed the world, one small step at a time. As the years passed, Harold Quinn's tiny army continued to grow in size and influence. What had started as a small experimental project in a cluttered garage had evolved into a global initiative with far-reaching implications. The technology that once seemed like a distant dream was now a cornerstone of innovation, reshaping industries and inspiring countless others to think beyond conventional limits. Harold, though busier than ever, made it a point to stay connected to the heart of the project. He spent most of his days mentoring new recruits, refining the miniaturization process, and collaborating with scientists from around the world. His workshop, once filled with makeshift gadgets and scattered blueprints, had transformed into a state-of-the-art laboratory, funded by grants and partnerships with leading research institutions. Despite the upgrades, Harold kept a few reminders of his humble beginnings: a dusty old radio he used to tinker with, and the framed photo of the original tiny army after their first mission. Ethan Cole and Mia Roberts remained central figures in the project, their leadership guiding the team through increasingly complex missions. Ethan's strategic mind and unwavering determination had earned him the respect of everyone in the tiny army, while Mia's ingenuity ensured they always had the tools they needed to succeed. Together, they became symbols of what could be achieved when courage met creativity. One day, Harold received an invitation that would take the tiny army to uncharted territory. A team of oceanographers reached out seeking help exploring underwater caves too narrow and treacherous for human divers. These caves, located off the coast of Australia, were believed to hold clues about ancient ecosystems and undiscovered species. The challenge was immense, navigating pitch-black tunnels filled with jagged rocks and unpredictable currents. But Ethan and Mia immediately saw it as an opportunity to push the boundaries of their capabilities. Preparations for the mission began weeks in advance. Mia worked tirelessly to design specialized equipment, including miniature submarines and waterproof suits equipped with advanced sensors. Ethan coordinated training exercises to simulate the conditions the team would face, ensuring every member was ready for the dangers ahead. As the departure date approached, excitement buzzed through the ranks of the tiny army. This wasn't just another mission. It was a chance to contribute to humanity's understanding of the natural world. On the day of the expedition, the team gathered at the edge of the ocean, their tiny forms barely visible against the vast expanse of water. Harold addressed them one last time before they embarked. "This is uncharted territory," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not just for you, but for all of us. You're not just explorers, you're pioneers. Remember why you're here and trust each other." With those words, the tiny army boarded their miniature submarines and descended into the depths. Above them, Lena Carter watched anxiously alongside a team of oceanographers. She had accompanied Harold to document the mission, her camera capturing every moment of the journey. As the submarines disappeared into the murky waters, she couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and apprehension. This was the most ambitious mission yet, and the stakes were higher than ever. Inside the caves, the tiny army faced challenges unlike anything they had encountered before. The darkness was absolute, forcing them to rely on their sensors and communication devices to navigate. Currents surged unpredictably, threatening to sweep them into sharp rocks or trap them in narrow passages. Yet despite the danger, the team pressed on, driven by a shared sense of purpose. Mia's inventions proved invaluable. Her miniature submarines glided smoothly through tight spaces, their reinforced hulls protecting the team from the harsh environment. When one of the submarines became wedged between two rocks, Ethan quickly devised a plan to free it using a grappling hook Mia had designed. Their teamwork was seamless, a testament to the countless hours they had spent training together. After hours of careful exploration, the team discovered something extraordinary: clusters of bioluminescent organisms illuminating the cave walls. These creatures, never seen before by human eyes, pulsed with soft, otherworldly light. The oceanographers monitoring the mission erupted into cheers when the footage reached the surface. It was a breakthrough discovery, offering insights into the evolution of life in extreme environments. When the tiny army finally returned to the surface, they were greeted as heroes. News of their findings spread quickly, captivating audiences worldwide. Scientists hailed the mission as a landmark achievement, while environmentalists praised the tiny army for advancing efforts to protect fragile ecosystems. For Harold, Ethan, and Mia, it was validation of everything they had worked toward, a reminder that even the smallest actions could lead to monumental discoveries. Back home, the success of the underwater expedition inspired new waves of interest in Harold's project. Schools across the country incorporated lessons about the tiny army into their science curriculums, encouraging students to think creatively and embrace innovation. Lena, who had documented the mission, published a book detailing the team's experiences. Titled Beneath the Waves, it became a bestseller, further cementing the tiny army's place in history. Brian Dawson, now a vocal advocate for unconventional ideas, wrote a glowing review of Lena's book. "The tiny army has shown us that greatness isn't defined by size," he wrote. "It's defined by the willingness to step into the unknown and make a difference. Harold Quinn's invention didn't just shrink humans, it expanded our potential." Even Sarah Miller, whose initial skepticism had given way to admiration, reflected on how much the project had changed her perspective. "I used to think stories like this only happened in movies," she said during a television interview. "But Harold and his team have proven that real-life heroes come in all shapes and sizes." As the months passed, the tiny army took on new missions, each more daring than the last. From exploring volcanic craters to assisting in disaster relief efforts, their work continued to inspire awe and gratitude. Yet through it all, Harold remained focused on the future. He knew there was still so much to discover, so many challenges to overcome. One evening, as he sat in his lab reflecting on the journey so far, Ethan and Mia joined him. They often came by after missions to debrief and share their thoughts, but tonight felt different. There was a quiet satisfaction in the air, a sense of accomplishment that went beyond any single mission. "You've built something incredible, Harold," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Not just the technology, but the spirit behind it. You've taught us that no challenge is too big if we face it together." Mia nodded in agreement. "And you've inspired so many people along the way," she added. "Kids dreaming of becoming inventors, scientists looking for new ways to solve problems. It all started with you." Harold smiled, humbled by their words. "None of this would have been possible without you," he replied. "You're the ones taking the risks, doing the hard work. I'm just the guy who gave you the tools." Lena, who had been quietly observing the conversation, spoke up. "You're all part of something bigger than yourselves," she said. "What you've done will inspire generations to come. That's what makes this so special." As the night wore on, the group talked about the future, new technologies to develop, new frontiers to explore, and new ways to use their skills to help others. For Harold, Ethan, Mia, and Lena, the journey was far from over. But one thing was certain: they had already changed the world in ways no one could have imagined. In the end, the story of the tiny army wasn't just about shrinking humans or completing impossible missions. It was about believing in the power of imagination, the strength of teamwork, and the courage to take the first step, even when the path ahead was uncertain. And as long as there were people willing to dream big and act boldly, the legacy of the tiny army would live on, proving that greatness truly knows no size.